So think about the last time you watched footage of like a massive controlled demolition.
Oh yeah, like a building imploding.
Exactly. You have this sprawling 50-story concrete skyscraper just completely dominating the skyline. And then in a span of maybe 10 seconds, it just folds inward.
It just turns into a cloud of dust.
Right, a cloud of dust. And to a casual observer walking by, it looks like this sudden, almost magical event, like a spontaneous disaster.
But for the demolition team, that collapse didn't happen in those 10 seconds.
Exactly. It happened, months earlier on a whiteboard.
Right. The moment the engineers calculated the exact load-bearing threshold of the central columns and planted the charges.
Yeah, the visual collapse is really just the final unavoidable symptom of a mathematical certainty.
The structure was dead the moment its structural integrity was compromised beyond the baseline. I mean, the physics were already written. The dust was just waiting to fall.
And that distinction, between the sudden emotional shock of the dust falling and the cold mathematical reality of structural physics, that is the absolute center of our deep dive today.
It really is. It changes everything.
We are taking a massive intellectual leap into a body of thought that radically re-engineers how we look at human history and, well, systemic survival in general.
Yeah, we're opening up Lecture 613 from the Tolu-e-Islam Digital Audio Archives.
Specifically, we're dissecting their breakdown of Surah Al-Anbiya, Ayat 34 through 38. And the mission for this deep dive, for you listening right now, is to completely categorically discard the traditional way these texts are usually read.
We have to throw out that traditional lens entirely. I mean, for centuries, these specific verses have been buried under layers of what we can really only call emotional moralizing. They've been turned into superstitious folklore, honestly.
So let's lay out the conventional reading first, just so you, the listener, know exactly what we are dismantling today.
A good idea.
Usually when you hear these verses, they're presented as this very somber, depressing reminder to get ready for the grief.
Right, it's like a funeral dirge.
Yeah, a funeral dirge. It's framed as this passive warning that God is out there handing down bad luck and good luck, essentially treating human life like some arbitrary psychological maze.
Just to see who has the patience to say the right prayers.
Exactly. It's an interpretation that completely strips human beings of any agency. We can call this the placeholder myth.
The placeholder myth. I love that. It's a brilliant way to describe it because, well, it's a narrative people insert when they don't understand the underlying mechanics of a system.
You just plug in a myth because you don't have the math.
Precisely. When you lack the vocabulary of systems engineering, you default to mythology. You assume the universe is run by a deity who operates like, I don't know, a capricious medieval king playing psychological games.
Right.
But the source material for today absolutely shatters that. It takes verse 35, which is usually read with tears and this melancholic submission.
Yeah, the heavy, mournful reading.
Right. And it reframes it as a masterclass in materials testing.
Okay, a masterclass in materials testing. Let's really dig into the mechanics of that because that's a massive shift.
It is.
If I'm building a bridge, I don't test its strength by, asking it how it feels.
No, you put a 100-ton load on it to see if the steel shears.
Exactly. Or if I'm an athlete, I put my cardiovascular system under the intense stress of a marathon to force adaptation. So how does the text apply this engineering principle to human life?
Well, the lecture argues that the text defines the universe as a zero-tolerance testing environment.
Zero tolerance.
Yeah. The terms used for hardships and prosperity in the traditional sense are completely redefined here. Hardship is actually structural deficit.
Okay.
And prosperity is structural surplus. The universe utilizes both of these extremes as intense, unyielding stress tests to audit the system.
Wait, I want to clarify this concept of an audit because calling the universe a zero-tolerance testing environment sounds incredibly bleak.
It can sound that way at first, yeah.
Right. If it's zero tolerance, how does any civilization survive its first mistake? I mean, humans mess up all the time.
Oh, for sure. But it isn't zero tolerance for individual day-to-day errors. It's zero tolerance for violating the laws of physics over the long term.
Ah, okay. The macro level.
Exactly. Think of an audit in a financial system. An auditor doesn't really care if you made a minor math error on Tuesday, as long as the ledger balances over the fiscal year.
Right, right.
But if you are systemically embezzling funds, the math will eventually catch you. The universe conducts a macro-level audit on civilizations.
So it's looking at the systemic trends.
Yes, it gives you a surplus of resources, wealth, technology, power to test, if your society will use that surplus to build equitable, lasting infrastructure. Or conversely, if it will bloat become decadent and rot from the inside.
Wow. And conversely, it introduces a structural deficit like a famine, an economic crash, or a pandemic to audit the resilience of your social fabric.
Precisely.
Does the society rally, innovate, and protect its most vulnerable, or does it fracture into violent tribalism?
That is the test. The universe is constantly applying pressure to see if you are genuinely built to last. It's an audit of structural integrity, not a test of emotional piety.
That is such a profound reframing, and I think that brings us to one of the most famously misunderstood phrases in this entire text.
Oh, I know exactly which one you mean.
Right. If we are replacing superstitious baggage with systemic reality, we have to look at the linguistics of kullu nafsin dakikatul maut.
Yes. A massive phrase in the cultural consciousness.
Traditionally translated as, every soul will taste death. And again, that sounds incredibly poetic. It sounds like something you engrave on a tombstone to make the grieving family feel a sense of, poetic closure.
It's pure sentimentality the way it's usually used.
Yeah. So how do we rescue a phrase like tasting death from being just sentimental rhetoric?
Well, by understanding the precise systemic definitions of the words nafs and maut.
Okay, break those down for us.
The source material emphasizes that this statement is not poetry. It is a foundational, inescapable law of biology and thermodynamics.
Thermodynamics,
Yeah.
really?
Yes, nafs does not simply mean a mystical floating soul. In a systemic context, it signifies an individualized conscious system. You are a nafs. I am a nafs. We are discrete biological systems processing energy.
Okay, so nafs is a bounded system.
Exactly.
And maut.
Maut represents thermodynamic closure, is the natural exhaustion of a biological system.
So it's not the Grim Reaper.
No, not at all. Think about entropy. Entropy is the measure of disorder in a system. To stay alive, your biological system requires massive amounts of energy to fight off entropy. You need energy to keep your cells dividing, your heart pumping, your brain firing.
Right, we have to eat, sleep, constantly refuel.
Exactly. But you are a closed biological loop. Eventually, the machinery degrades. The cellular entropy wins. The text is stating an absolute law of physics. Every individualized biological system is irrevocably bound by thermodynamic limits. It must shut down.
Maut is thermodynamic closure. That is mind-blowing. So the phrase isn't a threat from an angry deity.
Not at all.
It's a statement of physical law. It's the equivalent of saying, gravity pulls mass toward the center of the earth, or water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yes. And this is where the source material levels an intense critique against human psychology. Because historically, humanity absolutely despises this thermodynamic reality.
We hate the idea of limits.
We really do. We possess this deep-seated, completely irrational need to invent exceptions to the rule.
Oh, the psychological need for a bypass? You see this everywhere in history. We invent incredibly elaborate myths to pretend the laws of physics don't apply to certain special people.
Right, like kings claiming to be literal descendants of the sun to avoid being seen as mortal.
Exactly.
And the text aggressively confronts this. The source highlights how it points out that even the Prophet of Islam was subject to the exact same physical laws of nature.
And that frustrated people, didn't it?
Oh, immensely. The people of his era wanted a supernatural being. They wanted an angel who didn't need to eat, who didn't age, who, hovered above the ground.
You wanted magic, not a man.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But instead, the text repeatedly insists he eats food, he walks in the market, he bleeds in battle, and eventually he will undergo biological closure. There is no supernatural bypass to thermodynamics.
None. And yet, as the source notes, human beings still try to sneak that bypass in through the back door centuries later.
Oh, we're obsessed with finding a loophole.
Right. The lecture dissects how later generations started inventing these theological frameworks to claim that prophets aren't actually made of flesh, but are composed of light.
Yes, the light theory.
Or the incredibly prevalent belief that ancient saints are still physically alive in their graves, operating like this underground shadow government, pulling the strings of the universe.
It's a profound rejection of physical reality. People construct these elaborate hierarchies where they believe deceased historical figures have been delegated administrative powers over the physical world.
Like civil servants of the cosmos.
Exactly. If someone needs rain for their crops or a cure for an illness, instead of engaging with meteorology or medicine, the actual chains of cause and effect, they go petition a saint's grave. They truly believe the universe is managed by phantoms.
It's an attempt to hack the system.
That's exactly what it is, a shortcut.
Because if the universe is governed by strict, unforgiving laws of cause and effect, well, that requires a lot of hard work.
Right. You have to study the physics, you have to understand the social dynamics, you have to take responsibility.
Yeah, but if you can convince yourself that a dead saint can just grant you a miracle and bypass the physics, you absolve yourself of all systemic responsibility.
The source material fundamentally rejects this. It establishes that the universe operates on an unbreakable law of cause and effect. Nothing happens by chance, and nothing happens by magic.
No exceptions.
None. If a system is biological, it reaches thermodynamic closure. No system, no matter how spiritually enlightened, escapes this. If you want a result in the physical world, you must engage with physical causes. You cannot outsource your engineering problems to a phantom.
This sets up a perfect transition to a massive, immersive historical event the source material analyzes. Because everything we're talking about right now, the denial of thermodynamics, the emotional rejection of physical law, it isn't just an abstract theory.
No, it happened. It played out in real time.
With catastrophic potential immediately following the death of the prophet.
The events in Medina following the prophet's death are the ultimate case study in the collision between human emotion and systemic reality.
Let's paint the picture for the listener because the stakes were astronomical here. You have this nascent civilization that has just revolutionized the social, political, and economic structure of the entire region.
It was a complete paradigm shift.
And the entire movement was galvanized by one central figure, and then suddenly that figure undergoes biological closure. He dies.
The psychological shock to the community was so immense that their rationality completely short-circuited.
And we see this most vividly in the reaction of Umar.
Yes, Umar. Here's a man who was arguably one of the greatest, most strategic, and hyper-rational minds of his era.
Right. He literally went on to engineer the administration of a massive multi-continental empire.
Exactly. But in that specific moment of acute emotional trauma, his intellect just collapsed. He drew his sword in the middle of the public square and threatened to execute anyone who dared to say the prophet was dead.
He demanded a supernatural exception.
He did. He couldn't process the loss, so his brain simply rejected the laws of physics.
He essentially declared the thermodynamic laws we've been talking about do not apply to this one specific person. He has merely gone to commune with God and will return.
It is the ultimate manifestation of short-term emotional panic overriding systemic logic.
And you have to look at the sociological danger of that moment. If Umar's panic had become the dominant narrative, the entire civilization would have instantly degraded into a personality cult based on magic.
Instantly. If the survival of your system of justice depends on the physical immortality of its founder, your system is already dead. The universe does not grant physical immortality.
Which brings us to the intervention. How do you snap a society out of an emotional delusion of that magnitude?
Well, you don't argue with them emotionally.
Right. You reestablish the baseline physics, and that is exactly what Abu Bakr did.
Abu Bakr stepped into that absolute chaos, stood before Umar and the panicked crowd, and essentially recited the systemic law. He reminded them of the reality of kullu nafsin daikul maut.
And the exact phrase he used was a masterstroke of systemic clarity.
It really was. He said, if anyone worship Muhammad, let them know that Muhammad is dead. But if anyone worships the ultimate reality, the systemic laws of God, then know that those laws are ever living and never die.
It gives me chills just thinking about the intellectual weight of that statement. The system relies on universal laws, not immortal personalities.
He decoupled the movement from the biological lifespan of its leader.
He told them, if your dedication to equity, justice, and the rule of law dies simply because the biological hardware of the messenger failed, then you never understood the software in the first place.
Exactly. You were just following a person. You weren't following the physics.
That historical moment proves why the text is so militant against superstition. When a society loses its grip on rational, causal laws, it loses its agency.
Because if you believe the founder of your civilization is immortal, you stop taking responsibility for the structural integrity of your society. You just sit around and wait for the immortal leader to fix everything.
Right. Abu Bakr forced them to accept the thermodynamic closure of the prophet so they could actually take up the mantle of maintaining the social physics themselves.
It was a massive evolutionary leap for their society.
Okay, but this brings up a crucial paradox. If the universe is this perfectly engineered, zero-tolerance environment governed by strict physical and social laws, and if humans are capable of understanding this, why do we fail so often?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. Why did Umar, a certified genius, default to panic? This leads me to a major question about verse 37. The phrase is, "Khuliqal insanu min mahal." Traditional translations translate this as, "Man was created of haste."
A very literal, very unhelpful translation.
It's worse than unhelpful. I mean, it sounds like a blatant design flaw.
It does.
If we are looking at this through the lens of systems engineering, creating a core component of your system out of haste is a terrible idea. If I'm building a jet engine and the engineer tells me, hey, I built the turbine out of haste, I'm firing the engineer.
Oh, absolutely. That engine is going to explode.
Exactly. Why would a perfectly engineered universe hardwire a flaw like haste into human beings?
Well, to answer that, we have to radically redefine how we translate and understand the word ahal.
Mhm.
It is not a manufacturing defect.
Okay, what is it?
It is an evolutionary cognitive bias.
Okay, explain the mechanics of that bias. What does ahal actually look like in human psychology?
A child represents our biological hardwiring for immediate short-term sensory tracking. We are neurologically programmed to prioritize instant gratification and immediate sensory feedback over long-term invisible systemic stability.
But why? If it causes so many problems, why is the software written that way?
You have to look at the evolutionary environment in which human biology developed. For the vast majority of our history, we were hunter-gatherers.
Right.
In that environment, long-term thinking is actually a liability. If you are standing in the savannah and you hear a rustle in the tall grass, your immediate sensory tracking unit gel screams at you to run away right now.
Right, you don't sit down and run a statistical analysis on the probability of a lion versus a gust of wind.
Exactly. The humans who paused to calculate the long-term physics were eaten. The humans who reacted to the immediate sensory input survived and passed on their genes.
I see. So the bias toward immediate action, immediate calorie consumption, immediate threat avoidance, that kept us alive.
Precisely. But here is the systemic hurdle the text is pointing out. Humanity scaled up.
We built cities.
We moved from small nomadic tribes to complex global civilizations. And suddenly, that biological survival mechanism became our greatest systemic liability.
Because the threats changed.
Yes. Our hardware is perfectly tuned to avoid a tiger in the bushes, but it is woefully under-equipped to process the slow, invisible, multi-generational decay of an aquifer, or the compounding risks of a derivative-based financial system.
So the text saying man was created of a towel isn't a condemnation.
No, not at all.
It's an operator's manual. It's saying, be aware your default operating system is geared toward the immediate. If you rely solely on your sensory instincts, you will inevitably violate the long-term structural laws of the universe.
Building a civilization requires us to consciously, intellectually override our own evolutionary programming. We have to build institutions and laws that act as a prosthetic for our lack of long-term vision.
A prosthetic for our blind spots. I like that.
We have to engineer societal guardrails to protect us from our own towel. Because if we don't, we fall into the exact trap outlined in the very next verse, verse 38. And it's usually the elite of a society who are the most egregious victims of this short-term cognitive bias.
The reaction of the cynical elite in verse 38 is fascinating because, I mean, it feels like it could have been pulled from a modern corporate boardroom or a political press conference today.
So completely.
The verse quotes them saying, when is this warning going to actually happen if you're telling the truth?
It is the classic intellectual arrogance of a dying status quo. Look at the psychology at play there.
Right. They look around their immediate environment, they see their bank accounts, their military power, their gated communities.
And their immediate sensory feedback, their ASIAL, tells them everything is perfectly fine.
They are completely confusing a delay in the feedback loop with total impunity. Because the structural collapse hasn't hit them by Tuesday afternoon, they loudly assert that the laws of social physics simply do not exist.
They demand immediate, visible proof of long-term decay. The lecture identifies this as the tyranny of unproven assertions.
The tyranny of unproven assertions.
Yes. The elite make this massive, fatal assumption. They assume that long-term systemic debt will never be collected simply because the debt collectors haven't kicked in the door yet. They mistake the silence of the compounding interest for the absence of the debt.
I want to ground this in a modern analogy to make the mechanics completely clear for you listening. Imagine a massive manufacturing conglomerate.
Okay.
The CEO has been in charge for a decade. Over that decade, the CEO has systematically stripped the factory line of all its safety protocols. They've slashed the maintenance budget, they overwork the machines, and they are completely ignoring the structural fatigue of the metal parts.
That is a classic structural deficit.
Exactly. And why do they do it? Because cutting those costs makes the quarterly profits look incredible today. The short-term sensory feedback, the stock price, the board's applause, the annual bonus is highly positive.
That is agile in action.
Right. Now, imagine the structural engineers at this factory. They are running the math. They are looking at the thermodynamic stress on the turbine blades. They come to the CEO and warn them, hey, there's a catastrophic, mathematically certain breakdown coming. The metal is fatiguing at a molecular level.
And how does the CEO, driven by ale, respond?
The CEO laughs. The CEO points to the soaring stock chart and says exactly like verse 38, when is this breakdown going to happen? I don't see it. My stock is up today. The machines are running right now.
It's pure delusion.
The CEO mocks the engineers, completely unaware that the kinetic energy of that failure isn't magic. It is building up silently with every single rotation of the gears.
This is where the source's insistence on the law of cause and effect becomes paramount. Every single action has a corresponding reaction in the physical and social world. Consequences do not evaporate.
They just accumulate.
Exactly. The elite in the text, much like the CEO, are demanding a supernatural event. They want a lightning bolt from the sky. If God is real, they argue, why hasn't a lightning bolt struck my house?
They completely misunderstand how social systems collapse. The universe doesn't need to throw a lightning bolt.
The universe never throws a lightning bolt when a structural collapse will suffice. The compounding weight of their own systemic deficit will crush them. But because the collapse doesn't happen on their preferred, immediate timeline, they assume the law itself is a fabrication.
So how does the system respond to that arrogance? If you are the engineer screaming about the metal fatigue and the CEO is laughing at you, what is the universal law's counter-argument?
The text provides it in verse 37.
Right, where it states, I will show you my signs, so do not ask me to hasten them.
This is the absolute core of the social physics we are discussing. It is the law of requital in action. The text is stating that consequences operate on a fixed kinetic track.
A fixed kinetic track.
Yes. You cannot rush the timeline of a civilizational collapse any more than you can rush a chemical reaction or alter the orbit of a planet by yelling at it.
It is pure chemistry. If I mix two volatile compounds together, the reaction takes exactly the amount of time it takes for the electrons to exchange. I can't look at the beaker halfway through and say, see, nothing happened.
Let's break down the mechanics of how this compounds in a society. Let's look at how that fixed kinetic track operates.
Okay.
When a society bases its economy on the hoarding of wealth, when it relies on the exploitation of its working class, when it acts with structural deficit, which means it continually extracts more energy, labor, and resources from its environment than it replenishes, that decay doesn't show up immediately.
No, it hides in the margins.
Yes, it hides. The structural decay compounds silently. It happens atom by atom. It happens in the slow erosion of public trust.
Yeah.
It happens in the gradual degradation of infrastructure. It happens in the quiet desperation of a marginalized underclass. Each of these is a microscopic fracture in the load-bearing columns of the civilization. It builds up until it hits an exact critical threshold.
And once that threshold is crossed, the demolition is inevitable. The warning, do not ask me to hasten them, is the universe essentially saying. The math is already calculating. The variables have been entered. You cannot speed up gravity, and you cannot speed up the consequences of your own structural rot.
It is the ultimate audit. The text is issuing a stark, uncompromising warning to you, the listener. Do not let your short-term myopic bias, your ego, blind you to the absolute mathematical certainty of the long-term audit.
And in the terminology of the text, this inevitable audit is referred to as torsion.
Torsion, yes.
How do we translate that from a systems perspective?
It translates to the inevitable return to the ultimate systemic baseline. Imagine pulling back a thick rubber band.
Okay.
You can pull it back for a very long time, creating an immense amount of artificial tension.
Yeah.
That tension is the illusion of prosperity built on deficit, but you cannot hold it forever.
Right, your arm gets tired or the band snaps.
The laws of physics demand that the energy be released. Turgeon is the moment the rubber band snaps back to its resting state. Every system, no matter how artificially inflated by short-term exploitation, will eventually be forced to reconcile with the baseline of reality.
So the elites demanding the warning to be hastened are essentially pulling the rubber band back as far as it can go, looking at the tension and saying, look how stable this is.
Completely ignorant of the kinetic energy they're about to unleash on their own faces?
Wow, their ignorance is their executioner. The social physics outlasts any individual ego, any corporate monopoly, and any political empire.
It really does.
This completely upends the way these verses are normally read. We started this deep dive looking at a text that has been treated for centuries like a comforting or terrifying bedtime story.
The fairy tale.
A text used to make people submissive, to make them passively accept suffering as some mysterious divine test, and to make them look toward the afterlife for any sense of justice.
Instead, what the source material reveals is a rigorous, zero-tolerance physics manual for human civilization.
Yeah. It transforms the text into a blueprint for systemic survival. It demands active intellect, continuous auditing of our social structures, and a militant rejection of passive emotionalism.
It forces us to ask the hard engineering questions about our own society. Life, and human civilization by extension, is not a random lottery. It is an ongoing high-stakes stress test.
Exactly.
And in this test, our own evolutionary hardwiring, our obsession with the immediate, our cognitive biases, our age-alla, is our greatest liability against the fixed laws of thermodynamics and the law of requital.
The universe is playing a long, patient game of physics. Humanity keeps trying to play a short, frantic game of sensory gratification. And the physics will always inevitably win the long game.
The physics always wins. But that leaves us standing on the edge of a very precipitous cliff.
How so?
Well, if the buildup of this kinetic energy is silent, and if the elites are blinded by their own short-term success, what exactly does the breaking point look like?
What happens when the compounding debt finally hits that critical threshold and the protective shield of our cognitive bias shatters completely?
The source material addresses that exact moment next. In Lecture 713, which covers Surah Al-Anbiya, Ayat 39 through 50, the analysis shifts from the buildup of the kinetic energy to the exact moment of systemic impact.
The anatomy of the crash.
Yes. We are going to examine the precise moment where the consequences catch the arrogant elite entirely by surprise. It explores how the historical records of past civilizations are laid open to show the absolute continuity of this law, how every empire that thought it was the exception to the rule was leveled by the exact same physics.
So we're looking at the anatomy of systemic impact next time.
Exactly. Next time we deconstruct the impact.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought that builds on everything we've just discussed, but points toward our immediate future.
Go for it.
We spent a lot of time talking about how our ancient biological software, RHL, fails us in a complex civilization. But look at the modern institutions we've built today. Look at our social media algorithms, our high-frequency trading platforms, our 24-hour news cycles. We haven't built systems to mitigate RHL.
No, we've actually built systems that weaponize it.
Exactly. We have engineered a global technological infrastructure that perfectly optimizes and accelerates our short-term sensory tracking. We are feeding our own cognitive bias with supercomputers.
That's a terrifying thought.
So the question to mull over is this. If the universe guarantees a long-term systemic audit, what happens to a civilization that uses its most advanced technology not to look further into the future, but to trap itself entirely in the immediate dopamine-driven present?
Are we just pulling that rubber band back faster than any society in human history?
Right. The audit is always coming. The question is whether our technological acceleration is giving us the tools to survive it, or merely ensuring the impact will be unprecedented.
Because the universe doesn't accept our technological excuses.
And it certainly doesn't accept unproven assertions. Keep that in mind the next time you feel the urge to prioritize the immediate over the structural. Until next time, keep digging deeper.